All right, thanks. Oh, gosh. So all morning this morning, for whatever reason, I have been greeted by that music when I came up on stage. So thank you. It would have been a lot more dramatic if I could have come up through the floor with the smoke and all that. But my name's Ben. I'm one of the pastors here at West Winds. So glad you're here with us this morning. And we're continuing our way through the book of Hebrews. We're actually kind of on the home stretch here, last couple chapters. We're going to jump right in now to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. So let's take a look at these, and then we'll talk about them. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, and disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Now, I think we'd probably all agree that life is made up of moments. I mean, life is really just a collection of moments that we experience. Now, some of those moments are what I would call the extreme ones, the mountaintops and the valleys. But most of them are somewhere in the middle. You know, for me, one of my mountaintop moments was the birth of my kids, of both of my kids. And I remember my daughter, who's my firstborn. I remember the day she was born, holding her in my arms, the doctor handing her to me and holding her for the first time. Completely surreal, right? Just a moment that there's so much clarity, so much ambition, so much hope in that moment. Now, you should know this about me. I'm a crier. That's kind of my thing. So when the doctor handed my daughter to me, I held her and I introduced myself to her. I was telling her, promises. I was telling her how much I was always going to love her and be there for her and all this, and I'm crying to the point where the doctor comes up to me and says, dude, you need to hand me that baby. I think you're going to pass out and drop her. And I had to explain to him that this was kind of my process, and if you knew me, you'd understand that this is okay. But yeah, a big, big moment. Graduations, weddings, all of those things, even on the low end, funerals, sickness. There are some moments that we think of as defining. But as I said, those aren't the majority of the moments that we live in. I mean, the majority of our moments are Wednesdays, right? I mean, the majority of the moments that we have in our life are very normal and very similar to other ones. I can't be the only person who wakes up in the morning, gets my kids out the door for school, goes to work, works my job, comes home, tries to connect with my family, only to lay in bed at the end of the night and go, well, good, I get to do it again tomorrow. I think we all have felt that at some point, and at the same time, we have a tension that we want our lives to matter. Like we want to get something out of life. We don't want to settle for something ordinary. And I think the question that a lot of us are asking, even if we don't know quite how to articulate it, is how do I make this life count? Not the giant moments, but how do I make the everyday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all the same every day? How do I make those moments count for something? And how do I make them matter? How do I use them in such a way that my relationship with God increases, my relationships with people around me get better? I mean, how do I make that work? So in light of that, we look to these verses in Hebrews chapter 1 and 2. Now, Hebrews is written to specifically Christian people who are running around trying to get away from persecution. They're being persecuted by their own people, the Jewish religious leaders, as well as by the Romans, and they're just trying to hold on. So that's who this is being written to. And so let's put that back up on the screen. And let's look at 4 things that he says in this passage that I think connect to how we might live here and now. So at the beginning, he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith. And when he says therefore, that just means in light of what we've just read, so because we are surrounded by a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith. Now remember, what we've just read is Hebrews chapter 11. If you've been here any of the last several weeks, we've been working our way through that chapter, which is most commonly called the Christian Hall of Faith. It is a list of a number of people who are honored for the faith they had in God. Now, when we talk about faith, we really mean believing in God enough to do things His way even if we don't see it or if it doesn't make sense. So there's a whole chapter of people, named and some unnamed, who are honored for the fact that they did things God's way. And so the writer of Hebrews says, in light of the fact that we are surrounded by this crowd of witnesses, in light of the fact that you have all these examples, and then he goes on from there. But let's not gloss over that for ourselves, because we too are surrounded by a crowd of witnesses, both individually and as a church. I mean, I love Westwinds. It's been my church for the last 10 years. But Westwinds wasn't the first church, and there would be no Westwinds if there hadn't been churches that came before it. I mean, the reality is the very fact that you get to come in here this morning, grab a cup of coffee, sit, listen to the music, sing along, hear a message, any of those things, without the fear that someone is going to come in this door and take all of it away from you. The very fact that you get that privilege is because somewhere else, people didn't get that. Somewhere back in time, people actually had to face those things. The fact that we have religious freedom is because someone didn't. We all stand on the shoulders of someone else in that regard. And not only as a community, but also as individuals. Your story, and Dave said this last week very well, your story is bigger than just you. Your story's built on other stories. I mean, the story of Ben isn't really just about Ben. I mean, if you want to know the story of Ben, you've got to go to Phil and Jean Rosser, my mom's mom and dad, who had great faith in Jesus and built their lives around their relationship with God and raised their children that way. And when my dad and mom met and fell in love, my dad didn't have that same faith. And my grandparents got together and said, if our daughter's going to marry this idiot, we better at least take him in and keep him close so we can help him. And so they brought my dad in and they mentored him. They raised him to understand, in a sense, who Jesus was and what he'd done. As a result of that, my dad became a man of faith. And I was born into that family of faith. So the story of Ben isn't just about Ben. The story of Ben is about standing on the shoulders of his parents who stand on the shoulders of their parents. When I was in high school, I had a high school speech teacher who, after I gave a speech one day in class, a speech that I had not prepared for, that I just got up and just off the top of my head, and it was great, kind of like this morning, right? The speech that I just gave off the top of my head, who called me up after class, he was a Christian, and he said, listen, I think God might want you to speak. I think that might be part of your story. I mean, it changed my life. My youth pastor in high school, Rick Wood, who let me speak in one of our youth groups, and then afterwards said to me, God might be calling you to be a pastor. That changed my life. Like, my story isn't just about me. It's bigger than that. It's other people's stories along the way. Before we moved to Jackson, our family lived in Minnesota. And while we were there, I was working at a church. I met a man named Raleigh Lehman. And Raleigh was an older man. He'd been married for 60 years, had been a pastor for 50. His family was all intact. They all loved each other. They were all following Jesus. And I said to Raleigh, I want to be like you when I grow up. You got to tell me how to live like this. And Raleigh was such a humble and gracious man. He said, I don't know if I have anything to offer you. And I said, I'm not going to let you off the hook. If you'd be willing to have lunch with me once a week, I'll buy. You just say where and let me just ask you questions. And again, he said, I guess I'll do that. I don't think I have anything to offer. Such a humble and gracious man. And you'd think a man that was that gracious and humble and godly would pick a restaurant like Panera or a bagel shop or something like that for these weekly meetings. But instead, he chose Red Lobster. So for almost a year, I met one day a week with Raleigh Lehman, and I, gnawed on sugar packets and napkins while he ate the Admiral's Feast every week because I couldn't afford to buy meals for both of us. But he just talked to me about what it meant to be a husband and a father and a pastor. Changed my life. Dreaming about what it might be like to have a youth center someday. And now the hub is here. And Randy lost a battle to cancer a few years ago. But I stand on his shoulders. See, our stories are bigger than just us. It's not just your story. And if you want to fight against this idea that, well, it's just another Tuesday, you got to recognize that something bigger is happening than just whatever you're dealing with in the moment. You're part of something bigger. And with that said, I think you also have to see the other side. As much as you are part of a bigger story, it's your turn right now. You're here. In my story, those people that I mentioned, my mom, my grandfather, Randy, those people have passed away. Raleigh, their time was then, and they treated it faithfully. And as a result, it made a difference in my life. But they're gone now, but I'm not. It's my turn now. In that sense, Hebrews chapter 11 is being written over and over again. If Hebrews 11 was written a Christian hall of faith today, it would involve people who are here now and what they did. Think about it. The people in Hebrews 11, it's not like they were sitting there going through these things and believing in God and saying to themselves, well, there's going to be a book written about this later, so I better make sure I do it the right way. They had no idea that any of this was going to be recorded. They were just following Jesus. They were just trusting in God and living out their faith because it was their moment. So not only is your story bigger than your story, but also it's your turn right now. And the way you live and the things you do, they matter a lot. So he says, since we're part of a bigger story, and since it's our turn now, and you can put the passage back up on the screen, please. Since all of that is true, if you want your moments to be more than just moments, he says, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that easily trips us up. He makes a distinction between sin and weights that slow us down. Now, the sin part we probably understand. Those are morally wrong things that violate what God has told us to do in Scripture. Sinful behavior. But he makes the point that there is a category that's maybe not sinful, might just be stupid. I mean, in a sense, if my dad were saying this today, I think he'd say, you got to strip off the stupid, son. You got to set it aside. Because the reality is there are things that slow us down, even if they're not sinful behavior. Now, allow me to pry for just a second and just know that I'm in the same boat that you are. I mean, it's almost hypocritical for me to even say this, but I say it to make a point. There's nothing in the Bible anywhere that you will find that says, thou shalt not watch Netflix for 5 hours a day while neglecting your children and allowing them to raise themselves and distancing yourself from your spouse. That's not anywhere in the Bible. Also, interestingly enough, nowhere in the Bible does it say, thou shalt not go run around in the middle of the interstate until you get struck by a vehicle. None of those things are in the Bible. They're not morally wrong. They're just stupid. There are some things that we shouldn't do. And it's how we use our time. It's how we spend our money. It's the things we put into our body. It's the way we treat our relationships. There are some things that we just should stop for a second and think about, not is this right or wrong, but is this wise or is this stupid? You know, I spend a lot of time with college kids and young adults, people who are at the point of starting to consider being in a relationship that might lead to marriage. And a couple times a year, I'll have someone come to me or a couple that will come to me and they'll say, listen, we are really committed to staying pure sexually until we're married. That's important to us. So what should we do? And I always tell them, I think that's a great choice. I actually think that's one of those things that is biblical and that you should do. But they say, how do we actually do that? And I give them some advice. I almost always give them the same advice. Now, you can disagree with that. That's fine. You can be wrong today. But I'm just kidding. But you can disagree with what I'm saying. But this is what I tell them. I say, you got to have some boundaries. You got to set some rules up. Well, like what? I'll give you a good example. You should make a rule that says you're not going to be alone together late at night at one of your apartments, one of your houses. And whenever I say that, I get a look like I've got 3 heads, growing off my shoulders. What are you talking about? We can't hang out there. We can't just go over and watch Netflix at our place at 2 a.m. My response is the same. I say you can do anything you want to do. But if you believe that your story is bigger than just your story, if you believe it's your turn right now, and if you want your life to matter and count, and you have set a goal that you want to remain pure, you should be careful about what you do, because this is a story I've never heard. I've never had a couple come to me and say, we made this commitment that we were going to stay pure. And we failed. And I say to them, well, what happened? And they, well, we were at Starbucks. It was crowded, a lot of people sitting at a table drinking a latte, and one thing led to another, and no one ever says that. You know why? Because people don't do those things at Starbucks. Don't be stupid. Be smart about what you're doing with your life. Because we've all heard the story a million times where someone says, I was at an apartment late at night watching Netflix and something happened. He says, strip off the stupid stuff. Make decisions that reflect the fact that you believe your life matters, your story's big, and this moment right now is significant. And then he says, not only strip off the stupid stuff, but also pay attention specifically to the sin. He says, the sin that easily trips you up. Another translation there is entangles you or surrounds you. He's talking about the stuff that we know is wrong, but we kind of let it hang around us anyways. I mean, for most people that are Christians, most of us that have been following Jesus for a long time, we don't have moments where we go, man, I had no idea I should have stopped looking at that, or stopped hanging around that person, or stopped stealing that. We know those things. But still, we kind of let them hang around. And even though this is a creepy way to say this, almost like an anaconda curling itself around your feet, we just allow this stuff to entangle us to the point where all of a sudden we are surrounded and we're going, wait a minute, how do I get out of this? But you can't, because it's too late. So he says, strip off the stupid stuff and then don't get caught up by this sin that wants to trip you up. I was reading on the internet this week, and I will pop this up because I thought it was kind of interesting. I found that there's actually online a survival guide for how to survive an attack from an anaconda. You can actually look this up on the internet, and it tells you what to do if you were ever out in the Amazon somewhere and you were attacked by a giant snake. But it's weird, and I think it might be a little bit off, so I just wanted to share it with you this morning and see what you think. So here are the steps. There are 10 steps in total to survive an anaconda attack. Step 1, if you were attacked by an anaconda, do not run away. The snake is probably faster than you are. Step 2, instead, lie flat on the ground, put your arms tight together. Step 3, tuck your chin in, okay, laying down on the ground. Step 4, the snake will come and begin to nudge and climb over your body. Step 5, and I think this one's probably important, do not panic. Step 6, after the snake has examined you, it will begin to swallow you from the feet. Always from the feet. Don't worry about that. Permit the snake to swallow your feet and ankles. Again, it's important that you do not panic. I may be the only one, but at some point is anyone thinking, what if this snake decides to have dessert before dinner? What if he starts at the head? Like, how does any of this work? How can you be so sure? But they are very confident, these snake experts. Step 7, the snake will now begin to suck your legs into its body. You must lie perfectly still because this will take a long time. And then step 8, when the snake has reached your knees, slowly and with as little movement as possible, reach down, take your knife, and very gently slide it into the side of the snake's mouth, between the edge of its mouth and your leg. Then suddenly rip upwards, severing the snake's head. So I go, okay, I kind of see what they were doing there, but it's step 9 that kind of has me a little bit concerned. Tell me what you think. Step 9, be sure to have your knife with you. And then step 10, be sure your knife is sharpened. I mean, doesn't it seem like those steps should come somewhere earlier in the thing? I don't know about you. I was talking to Kevin, who's leading us in music this morning, and he said, I don't care what the steps say. I'm running. I'm betting on myself, man. You know, I look at that and I go, that's so dumb and so ridiculous, obviously. But as I was reading it in context of this week, I thought to myself, man, this is what I do when it comes to sinful behavior. I see it coming and I go, maybe I'll just lie down. Maybe I'll just let it swallow my feet and then I'll deal with it later. The writer of Hebrews says, if you want your life to count more than just the moments, man, don't get involved in the stupid stuff and then steer clear, far away from the sinful behavior. Strip off the stupid and steer clear of the sinful behavior. Now, here's why this is difficult for us to do. Because it involves evaluation. In other words, in order to know what you're possibly doing that is potentially damaging to you, whether stupid or sinful, you got to step back and you got to look hard into yourself. Now, this is a challenge, and I'll tell you why. Because we're all really good at evaluating other people. I bet the people that are closest to you, you can tell me everything they're doing wrong, everything they're doing stupid and sinful. But we're very bad at evaluating ourselves, right? Nobody lies to you as well as you do. And because of that, it's crucial, it's of utmost importance that you have people in your life, community, who are allowed to say things to you. You have to have people who are allowed to say to you, you are being stupid and you can't keep doing it. You have to have people that can say to you, the direction you're headed is not going to give you what you want. You have to have people who can say to you, there's a snake. Don't let it grab your feet or whatever. You have to have those people. And if you don't, then you run the risk of missing this. You run the risk of underestimating a moment or missing what God is doing in that. So he says, because your story isn't just about you, because it's part of a bigger story, and because at the same time, it's your turn right now and your life matters, you got to strip away the stupid, you got to steer clear of the sinful. And then he says this. He says, also, let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. Now, we've talked a lot over the last few weeks about running with endurance, so I'm not going to belabor that point right now. It just really means let's continue without quitting to have faith in God. But I want to focus on that last part. He says, let us run the race with endurance that God has set before us. Run the race that God has set before you. I think this is an interesting point because for some of us, it's very difficult to just focus on what God is doing in us. We are all good at running the race that God has set before someone else. And we do it in two directions. On one hand, it's easy to look at some people and feel that you are better than they are. And then, if you're not careful, you will go, you know what? I'm running the race fantastically because I'm doing it better than that other person. Look how well I'm doing. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there are people that you perceive as being better than you. And you look at them and go, oh, I'm a failure. Look how well they're running the race. Look how well they're doing. Look how much money they're making. Look how good their kids are. But the reality is, all God is ever asking you to do is run the race that is set before you. He's asking you to do what he has put in front of you to do. And the quickest way to miss the race he has set before you is to focus on the race that he has set before someone else, whether they're better or whether they're worse. And I get this. I mean, I go to Walmart. It's easy enough to walk around and go, man, I am a champion. At the same time, I work with John and Dave. Dave is the smartest person I have ever known, like really know and talk to and hang out with. He uses words that I don't even know what they are. I've known the guy for 10 years, and he still uses words that he's used for 10 years. I don't know what they mean. I'm too embarrassed to tell him I don't know what they mean, so I try to use them back in a sentence, but I mess it up. He's a smart guy. And if I want to compare myself to his intelligence, I will miss the race that God has set before me. God hasn't told me to be Dave. God's told me to be Ben and to do what God has put in me to do. Right? John is the most creative person I know. I mean, John's the guy who will tell you that he's been storing light bulbs in his garage for the last 20 years, and you don't know why, because who does that until he puts them up all over the auditorium and it looks really cool. And then he tells you that while he put them up, he wrote 18 songs. And grew a beard. You can't compete with any of that stuff. And it's so easy to get caught in either direction running somebody else's race. But here's why this matters. Because maybe you feel like what you've got going on isn't good enough. I mean, I believe there are some of us in here that are profoundly discontent. That we look at our lives and we go, it is not what I wanted. It is not what I planned out. It is not the way it was supposed to be. I'm not as far along as other people are. Or maybe you're someone who just has pain in your past or failure in your past. And maybe you've been in prison, divorce, affair, addiction, any of that. And you just go, there's no way. There's no way it works now. But this is what the writer of Hebrews is telling us, is you've got to run the race that's set before you. God is calling you to something now. The life you're living now matters. It's significant. regardless of what's happened in the past, regardless of what will happen in the future. Right now, in this moment, he's calling you. And he's saying, I have something specifically for you, and it doesn't need to line up with anyone else. God is not measuring you based on other people. God's love for you isn't scaled. It's infinite. You can't scale infinity. He doesn't love you based on where you rank. He loves you based on who you are and who he is and what he's called you to do. So the writer of Hebrews says there's nothing that will help you treat each moment as if it matters and get through those kind of everyday Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday moments like running the race that he's put in front of you to do. And then he wraps this whole thing up by saying this. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he's seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. So he says, if you want your life to matter and count, you've got to realize that your story is bigger than you, but at the same time, it's your moment and the way you live now matters. You have to strip off the stupid, and you've got to steer clear of the sinful, and you've got to run the race that is uniquely yours. And the way you do all of that, the way all of this works, and this is where we'll land, is he says you got to keep your eyes on Jesus, man. You've got to fix your eyes on Jesus. You've got to keep him always in the center. I do a lot of weddings in my job as a pastor, and one of my favorite things at a wedding to watch is the groom watching the bride come down the aisle. Does that make sense? I like to watch the groom as he sees his bride coming down the aisle. Because on a wedding day, nobody is prettier in the room than the woman that is walking down the aisle. And this guy's sitting here like he just won the lottery. And I watch him, and he does not take his eyes off the woman that is about to become his wife. I could light off fireworks next to him. He is not breaking his eyes away from what he is seeing. The writer of Hebrews says you've got to fix your eyes on Jesus. Now, I know that's a little tricky because we don't see him. But here's what that really means. He's just saying you've got to keep Jesus in front of you. Did you know, this might surprise you, if you're looking straight ahead, you can't see something that's behind you? You're welcome. You can't see something that's behind you because your eyes are here. That means if you're going to keep your eyes on Jesus, he's got to be in front of you. And if he's in front of you, that means you're following him. You've got to keep Jesus and his way front and center. But what does it mean specifically? And he actually tells us here. He says, because of the joy awaiting him, that being Jesus, he endured the cross. You want to know what to focus on when we say keep Jesus in front of you? It's the cross. It's what he has done for you already. It's his death on the cross. And as we approach Easter Sunday, it is important to remember that what we really believe in, what we're putting our faith in, is what Jesus has done for us. We have not been asked to put our faith in something that will come later. It's not like God said, hey, I'm good for it, I promise. Just believe in me and I'll die for you down the road. He did it already. He's paid the price. It's finished. The work is done. And so when he says to us, keep me in front of you, when the writer of Hebrews says you want your life to matter, keep Jesus in front of you. What he's saying is do not get past the cross. Don't get past the reality of what Jesus has done for you. After the 8:30 service this morning, somebody came up to me and said, I just read a book that had a quote in it, and it just went along perfectly with what you said this morning. So since I'm a preacher, I stole it. And here's what it says. It's by a man named Francis Schaeffer. He said, we must remember throughout our lives that in God's sight, there are no little people, no little places, and no little moments. Only one thing is important, to be given fully to God in the place he has for us and the moment that he has given us. And I read that quote and I think that's what I want for my life, and that's what I think the author of Hebrews is saying to us, is that if we can recognize that our story is bigger than just us, we stand on the shoulders of the story of God moving throughout the world. And if we can realize that right now is our moment, it's our time, it's our turn. And if we can strip off the stupid stuff that's slowing us down and steer clear of the sinful behavior that will ruin our lives and run the race that God has uniquely given to us, and if we can do all that by keeping Jesus and his work and the cross in front of us, then our lives will be huge. And they'll matter no matter how we feel in the moment. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for the opportunity to look at this passage, and thank you for the encouragement that comes from your word. God, because of who you are, our lives are so significant. What we do now matters so much. And God, we are writing history even as we speak in this moment by how we live in relationship to you. So God, expose in us our stupid and sinful behaviors and bring friends, faithful friends around us to help us see that. Remind us that our story is bigger than just us, but yet this is our turn, and we're responsible for that. And then, God, help us not to look at anyone else's story, help us not to try to live anyone else's life, but instead to live the unique life that you have called us to, all the while keeping our eyes firmly fixed on you because of your great love for us. Amen.